Rolling heads and clean guts. The history behind this fruit is quite harrowing. Pumpkins are fodder to the imagination. From ghoulish jack-o'-lanterns to the foreign monstrosities, they distort our sense of reality sitting placidly in place. Yet pumpkins and their evil twin squashes have a disturbing history of their own. How did they become the symbol of seasonal horror by usurping the spotlight of another traditional vegetable? How are they linked to blood-chilling ancient rites in early American history? And why are they one of the biggest useless crops today, despite having saved early colonists from destitution? You are about to find out as I share my own plight growing these finicky fiends to prepare a most unconventional, fully plant-based pumpkin pie, sure to raise terror in the vegetable aisle without causing guilt or remorse. Come sit a spell and hear of the harrowing life of the marrow. If you ever decide to grow your own pumpkins or squash, you will quickly come to the conclusion that sun exposure is key for good results. I learned this the hard way, so this year I was intent on growing butternut squash in the front part of the yard. That would mean lots of hard work to clear the area from all the perennial weeds carpeting the ground. This slope faces due south, and for us in the northern hemisphere, that is prime location for growing the vines. I would even say that if you don't have a spot with at least 8 hours of direct sunlight, don't bother trying to grow pumpkin or squash. Much like cucumbers, they can be finicky, but it all boils down to sun and rich soil. They love growing in compost piles because of all the excess nutrients. They also need lots of water to grow fast and set fruit before pests descend onto these generous vines. This has got to be one of the best soils I've seen around the property. However, it's one of the worst in terms of the amount of roots that are growing in it. So it has to be slow work. It might take me more than a day. Patience is key when dealing with these things, and don't work yourself to death. Pumpkins and squash have a lot to do with survival and death, prosperity and demise. You'd be surprised. Nothing says fall as pumpkins. They star as the horrifying harbinger of Halloween, as well as the wholesome symbol of Thanksgiving. They are more American than American pie, and by American I mean truly American, as in Western Hemisphere American. These vines go way back. The old world knew of other gourds and melons, but pumpkins and squash were novel fruit to early European colonizers. Some, like Captain John Smith, were disappointed. After tasting what he thought was a melon grown by Native Americans in Virginia, he described the fruit as less and worse. Certainly, he expected juicy melon and got a mouthful of bland, dry squash. Smith was not alone in his dislike for squash. It still elicits terror to many at mealtime. Modern surveys have grouped squash with beets, turnips, Brussels sprouts, popularly loathed veggies. After clearing the land, I directly seeded butternut squash in the beginning of May, once soil temperatures had warmed into the 60s. I dropped a few seeds every 3 feet or so and waited for spring grains to do their magic. All I had to do was to add grass clippings as mulch to protect exposed soil, retaining moisture and fertility. While they come in a myriad of shapes and sizes, there are about 4 main species of domesticated cucurbita, how the genus is called. What is a pumpkin and what is a squash is really a question of semantics. Pumpkin is not a botanical term. The modern round orange pumpkin we instantly recognize as such is the same species as zucchini, a summer squash, Cucurbita pepo. Cucurbita maxima, moscata, and angiosperma are the other 3 main species of squashes and pumpkins. You may be surprised to learn that most canned pumpkin pie filling is made with a type of winter squash, and not the round orange field pumpkin we associate with the season. It is not that pumpkins are not edible, they are, but their taste and texture can't compare to other varieties like butternut or kabocha. That is why I rather grow butternut squash in my own garden, since I grow them to be eaten. About a month later, with good weather, my plantlets looked stout. Since I don't depend on them to survive, I was risking growing them in the open at the mercy of groundhogs and deer. It did take a while for Europeans to accept pumpkins and squash as human food. The upper class derided them as animal feed, or worse yet, food for the poor. Yet for early colonists in America, the pumpkin proved to be a lifesaver. Native Americans of the Northeast cultivated several types of squash, the name originating from the native word ascuta squash. The abundant fruit would store well, providing nourishment through the harsh winters. A primitive version of pumpkin pie was concocted by famished pilgrims in the 1600s. The top of the pumpkin was cut out and the interior cavity was filled with milk, honey, and spices. The top was put back on and it was then cooked amongst hot ashes. By the 19th century, hot ashes and pumpkins would take on a more sinister permutation as the Halloween jack-o'-lantern. The original Protestant Puritans would have repudiated this practice that has its roots in Irish culture, combining pagan and Catholic traditions. Ancient agrarian societies believed their prosperity directly depended on appeasing the spirit world. My food forest here is starting to experience exuberant growth. It's just amazing how much difference it makes to have good soil exposure and good soil. Today we know the natural causes for a lot of what ails us, but traditions die hard. All Hallows Day had been celebrated for centuries in Europe. Around the last days of October, the Irish would carve turnips into frightful lanterns, putting a hot coal inside to scare away evil spirits roaming that night. An Irish tale speaks of a cunning blacksmith called Jack that bamboozled the devil, and as a result, when he died, he was neither accepted in heaven nor in hell and was forced to roam the earth ever since. With a half-eaten turnip at hand, he fashioned it into a lantern to house his last piece of glowing coal to light his path as he wandered the cold night. That is where jack-o'-lanterns come from. With the mass immigration of Irish into America in the 19th century, the pumpkin became the preferred vegetable, being much easier to carve, having a built-in cavity. The legend of Sleepy Hollow with the headless rider carrying a jack-o'-lantern for a head has since colored the American imagination. 50 days after sowing my squash seeds, the vines look like something out of a fairy tale. The butternut squash here has just exploded with growth. I've never seen anything quite like this. It's amazing. I mean, it must be able to produce something in this location. It just means that I have to develop this front area more so I take advantage of this full-on south-facing slope. But I'm gonna wait for that to happen before I count the chickens for the eggs. When it comes to horrors and pumpkins, all this 19th century lore is but child's play when compared to its ancient American history. Tighten your seatbelts, cause things are about to get a lot more disturbing. But first, we have to understand the origins of this plant. Squash was the first crop to be domesticated in the Americas, preceding corn and beans, the other two giants of Native American cuisine. Arguably, corn and beans are more useful and nutritious than the watery, fibery pumpkin. The initial wild squash was most likely small and bitter, without much flesh, yet it was actually the oil and protein-rich seeds that attracted the first Native Americans. The area below Mexico City is regarded as the birthplace of domesticated squash based on archaeological evidence, including the findings of seeds and stems. Recent studies of ancient human stools have identified squash pollen in them, indicating how these plants were an important part of the diet of these ancient Mesoamericans. Not only were pumpkin seeds nutritious, they had a gross medical use. Pumpkin and squash seeds have deworming properties that may have helped native populations maintain a healthy gut by expelling worms. Modern in vitro studies have shown their efficacy against common gut worms. Traditional Mexican sauces called moles often feature pumpkin seeds, pepitas, as a main ingredient. They're also rich in zinc, another essential mineral to the human diet. But their power to expel gut parasites is not the most disturbing aspect of pumpkins. Regardless of the history, what disturbs a gardener like me is the thought of waking up one day to find the vines withering without setting fruit. So far, I was in luck. Whoa, the squash is growing by leaps and bounds, and it's starting to set fruit. Much better performance than last year, and it's actually the same seed. I do wonder if pests will get to it because I've been kind of taking a lazy approach in terms of pest management. I've tried to remove some eggs of squash bugs that I've seen, but I kind of want to see how far this vine can go without too much intervention, if it will produce, because if that's the case, location is truly everything in gardening. That means I'll have to retire that side of the garden that's a little bit shadier for the sun-loving plants like squash, tomatoes, beans even, and put them here and towards the front and let that side be for the greens that so much love the partial shade in the afternoon. Last year, I grew a couple of vines in the groundhog-proof beds and made sure to remove the eggs of squash bugs using a piece of tape as a hack. I was successful in keeping those in check, but the location was just not sunny enough to make the plants grow fast and produce before other pests like the squash vine borers arrived at the scene. As a result, I ended up with a withered vine and a puny squash. This time, I banked on fast growth in the sunny location and took a more hands-off approach with the pests, and it was working much better. I would not be surprised if this vine just decides to grow all the way to the bank over there into the road. Harvest can be unpredictable due to many factors. No wonder ancient societies came up with all kinds of rites and traditions to achieve prosperity. According to anthropologist Thomas Grigsby, the deep-seated rituals surrounding the planting and harvesting of the Champola squash, Cucurbita angiosperma, in rural Mexico harken back to ancient traditions set before European invasion. Grigsby argues that the sowing and harvesting are linked to cycles of the planet Venus, which was tied to rain and fertility through a mythic tradition that transforms blood into water. In isolated rural communities, locals perform pre-Columbian rituals that involve making offerings to dwarf spirits they believe can influence the weather and harvest. After making offerings to the ahueque, how they call these spirits, they sow squash seeds in June 13 for the seeds to emerge 8 days later on the 21st, the summer solstice. By October 20th, the squash vines are harvested and the seeds are taken out and spread out to dry. 8 days later, on October 28th, a first fruit offering of ayahuachimoli, or green mole, is made from the squash seeds. To them, October 28th marks the return of the dead, culminating on November 1st and 2nd, the Dia de los Muertos, and the Catholic All Souls Day. Academic research has questioned the pre-Hispanic roots for Dia de los Muertos since it synchronizes with the Catholic calendar too neatly. But Grigsby sees the harvesting of the squash and offering of the mole verde as echoes of truly ancient and sinister rites. Champola, the name of the squash, comes from the Nahuatl word tzompole, big head, and weirdly enough, just like in the recent American jack-o'-lantern tradition, pumpkins were associated to decapitated heads in Mesoamerica. In the Popol Vuh, the mythological writings of the Mayans, the hero twin Hunahpu is decapitated, his head rolling into the ceremonial ball court. It is then replaced by a carved squash so that he can still play their ritual ball game. Some think that Mesoamericans may have played this ritual ball game that often ended in sacrificial decapitation as a way of ensuring the rains and seasons stayed in schedule. The weather had cooperated with me so far, but a dry spell threatened to undo everything. The butternut squash has started to fruit, and they're beautiful large fruit. There are several of them around here, but I've had to water with a hose. It just hasn't rained for 4 weeks, and that actually caused another bigger issue that I'm worried about. I saw a groundhog a few days ago, and I noticed that it was going to probably attack. While my other plants were safe inside their cloisters, the squash vines were particularly at risk. I protected the developing fruit with chicken wire because I knew that with the dry spells, groundhogs would be attracted to the watery fruit. I just hope that the clouds finally let some decent rain, but it's been high 90-degree days without much of a respite of rain. Sometimes life is, especially in gardening, is full of obstacles, and you just have to roll with the punches. In ancient Mesoamerica, prosperity and sacrifice, birth and death were two sides of the same coin. When villagers cut the squash open on October 28th to extract the seeds and make the sacred ayahuachimoli to offer it to the dwarf spirits for their help with the fertile harvest, they are evoking ancient rites. Grigsby explains that this mole made of squash seeds and chilies represents a transubstantiation of sacrificial blood. Birth and death are thus inexorably linked by blood. An ancient Mayan mural associates a squash to the womb, birth, and blood by depicting blood gushing from its insides as 5 figures are born. An incantation to cause bleeding from a native doctor further links squash seeds and chili peppers to blood. The deep color of the mole is, weirdly enough, another strong connection, since blood was called chalchilhuatl, precious jade water. The deep green jade stone was highly regarded by the Aztecs, and although human blood is red, it was associated with the precious green jade. Meanwhile, my squash plant was pumping sugars from its sap into the several developing fruits. This is typically the time when bugs and diseases descend on the vines, making them especially susceptible to destruction. While butternut squash is more resistant to squash bugs, I was still spotting several eggs under the leaves. If the vines could hold on just a couple more weeks, I would soon have good mature fruit to harvest. To ancient people who depended immediately on their crops to survive, harvest was a matter of life and death, so sacrifices had to be made. Sacrificial blood was thought to give life. Decapitation, flow of blood, and sacrifice were central in the Mesoamerican worldview, figuring prominently in the written and archaeological record. Furthermore, the two main ingredients of the green mole, the squash seed and the chili pepper, were euphemisms for the male and female anatomy, and the seed's lanceolate form is also linked to a flint knife, the main tool for sacrifice. In a Nahua myth, the main god Quetzalcoatl performs automutilation, bleeding from his member, to create a man and a woman. This harrowing self-mutilation was also practiced in real life by ancient Maya. They pierced themselves and passed string through to soak the sacrificial blood. Thankfully, in modern America, the pumpkin doesn't hold such foreboding ritual connections. Oh, isn't this a beauty? I'm here braving the hordes of mosquitoes to be able to harvest my first butternut squash from this vine, and it really is the first successful butternut squash I've grown here. Last year I had the fiasco of a tiny butternut squash, but I'm glad that the vine isn't even showing too many signs of distress. And this is not the only fruit. There may be a lot more coming. Despite the earlier failure and late scare, I had plenty to be thankful for and had to celebrate. I'm back at my mom's house to prepare this quite unusual pumpkin pie. Of course, they're not pumpkins, they're more like squash, although I got these seeds from the compost, and I'm pretty sure they're some kind of a hybrid because the form changed from more of a butternut squash to even pumpkin-like. And we had so many fruit last year. The vine was insane. Groundhog did not attack it, and squash bug didn't seem to affect it at all. And we had more than, I believe, 40 of these, and these are the last ones, the last surviving ones. They've been here for basically a year, and you can see how well they still are preserved, just being room temperature. In this pumpkin pie, I use a rather unorthodox ingredient, chickpeas. That's because this is a gluten-free pie, and they make a good graham cracker style crust. They're also very nutritious. So I mashed 4 cups of drained, canned chickpeas with a fork and dehydrated them in a low oven until flaky. The other main ingredient for this crust was about half a cup of frozen coconut oil. I did these steps first before starting on the filling. Every so often, I stir the dehydrating chickpeas with a spatula. For the filling, I peeled and cut about half of a butternut squash, as well as 2 small sweet potatoes, cooking them with a bit of water until tender. It is interesting to note that we often neglect pumpkins in our modern diet, save for celebrations. If in ancient times it gained symbolic charge because of its usefulness and centrality to survival, today it has become just a symbolic shell. More than 1 billion pounds of pumpkins are produced annually to be nothing more than decoration in the United States. We've bred the modern fall pumpkin to serve as nothing more than a stage set prop. In many ways, it's a symbol of what we value most about our society. We sacrifice substance at the altar of skin-deep appearances. We never liked pumpkin that much, despite its health-promoting properties, but we've always loved the idea of them. Historian Cindy Ott analyzes the modern pumpkin as a metaphor for our culture. The Atlantic giant pumpkins, monstrous vegetables that can weigh close to a ton, are especially symbolic. The centerpiece of county fair competitions and world records, they've captured the American imagination like no other giant vegetable. Choice seeds for these mammoths can go for hundreds of dollars around enthusiasts. Resources and attention are poured into a single fruit. Straining from their own weight, these gourds grow into asymmetrical blobs. Its rind is so thick, it's inedible. Even cattle can't use it. But the common front door pumpkin is equally useless. Once the dehydrated chickpea was cooled, I created the crust by pulsing it with about a quarter of a cup of brown sugar and the half cup of frozen coconut oil broken into pieces. I then pressed the crust onto a 9-inch pie plate using a spoon. Once formed, I put it back into the freezer while I prepared the filling. For the filling, I dropped the cooked squash and sweet potatoes into a high-speed blender, adding about 1 can of coconut milk. I sweetened the mixture with a third of a cup of brown sugar, but you can adjust it to taste. Finally, I added a teaspoon of pumpkin spice, which included cinnamon and a dash of nutmeg to give it a nice aroma. Once blended, I simmered the mixture over a medium heat, stirring constantly, being careful not to get burned by the vicious bubbling, until the mixture had the thickness shown here. I then poured it onto the crust and baked it for an hour on a 350 Fahrenheit oven. Once cooled or refrigerated, it's good to eat. As for the pumpkins, Cindiot argues that they just transcend into pure meaning. They symbolize the land's natural bounty and the primitive way of life. Pumpkins are nostalgia. They reference a rural idyll. Pumpkin even became a term of endearment to children. They encapsulate the gentle agrarian life we as a society anxiously left behind, yet hope to unrealistically return to one day. That is why most people who grow giant pumpkins are backyard growers who wish to live out the agrarian myth outside of 9 to 5. Pumpkins are the perfect containers for our myths, memories, and aspirations. And I must say that they can be absolutely delicious, even if they're not even pumpkin but squash. If you like this video, you may want to check out my previous 3 videos on the history of lettuce, beets, and cucumber. You can also help me produce more in-depth content like this by purchasing art in my Etsy shop or by contributing through my Patreon. I'm thankful to all of you who made this possible. You are the reason why this video exists. If you're new here, remember to subscribe so you know when a new video is out. See you next time.